Three earthquakes above magnitude 4 strike the Granada area inside a single hour. The first hits Gojar at 10:37 in the morning. 16 minutes later, the ground moves again under Churiana de la Vega. People walk out into the street in their work clothes. Others stand in doorways and count the seconds. The numbers behind this are already large. Spain's National Geographic Institute, the government agency that measures earthquakes, has recorded 348 seismic events in this area since Saturday. That is 348 separate movements of the ground in 4 days. Residents have physically felt 37 of them. Emergency services took more than 500 calls in the minutes after the first big one. Not one call, not 50, more than 500. This is not a single earthquake. Something significant is happening under Granada. Today we break down exactly what is shaking beneath this city, how big these quakes really are, and what scientists say comes next. No guessing here, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes for the people living through it. Have you ever felt an earthquake swarm like this one? Not one big shock, but tremor after tremor over days. Tell us in the comments what that felt like, especially the waiting. The strange part is never knowing whether the next one will be smaller or bigger. Where were you standing when it happened? Earth Dispatch tracks every significant earthquake swarm as it develops, not just the first headline. Subscribe to follow whether Granada's shaking grows or fades over the coming days. We will stay on this story until the ground under Granada settles down, and there is a lot to explain. Go back to Saturday, August 15th. The morning is ordinary across the Vega de Granada, the wide, flat farming plain that spreads out below the city. Farm trucks on the small roads, shops opening, tourists walking uphill toward the old quarter. Then, near the town of Alhendín, the ground moves. Alhendín is home to nearly 10,000 people, and it sits about 8 kilometers south of the center of Granada. That is a 10-minute drive. The distance between that epicenter and 500,000 people is almost nothing. Spain's National Geographic Institute, the state body that measures every tremor in the country and goes by the initials IGN, puts the official size of that quake at moment magnitude 4.8. Moment magnitude, written as MW, is the modern scientific scale for how much energy an earthquake releases, and at this size it lines up closely with the Richter scale most people grew up hearing about. In the first hours, Spanish media reported the quake somewhere between magnitude 5.0 and 5.2. That gap is normal. Early readings arrive fast and rough, then get corrected as more monitoring stations report in. The final figure, 4.8, is the one scientists stand behind. The magnitude only tells you half the story. The other half is depth. This was a shallow focus earthquake, meaning it started less than 10 kilometers below the surface, and almost every event in this swarm has been that shallow. Depth matters more than most people realize. Energy released 10 kilometers down has almost no rock left to travel through before it reaches the floor of someone's apartment. A magnitude 4.8 sitting 60 kilometers deep would barely rattle a window in Granada. The same quake at 8 kilometers throws pictures off walls and wakes every person in the building. That is why a number that sounds moderate on paper felt violent in person. The reach tells you the same thing. People felt this quake in Madrid, roughly 360 kilometers to the north. They felt it in Murcia, in Albacete, and in Ciudad Real, all of them hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter. A quake centered under a small town south of Granada moved furniture in a capital city 4 hours away by car. Shallow energy and the right kind of rock travels, and it travels far. Inside the Granada area, the response was immediate. Emergency services logged more than 500 calls in the window right after the shaking stopped. Most were people asking the same two questions. What was that? And is it going to happen again? Around a dozen of those calls needed medical assistance, and most of them were anxiety attacks rather than physical injuries. That detail matters. It tells you the ground did something to people's nervous systems before it did anything to their buildings. In the towns closest to the epicenter, families spent Saturday night outside. Parents carried sleeping children down stairwells. Some people slept in cars and parks on plastic chairs in front of their own front doors because a building you cannot trust is worse than no building at all. Local officials asked residents to stay out of older structures until inspectors cleared them. There is no dramatic way to describe that scene, and there does not need to be. It is simply what an entire valley does when it stops trusting the floor. That reaction has a reason behind it. The last time an earthquake of comparable strength hit this exact part of the province was 1956, when a magnitude 5.0 struck near Atarfe and Albalote, two towns on the other side of the Vega. That quake caused real damage, and it still sits in the local record as the benchmark event. 1956 is roughly 70 years ago. 70 years is long enough for towns to be rebuilt twice, for 3 generations to grow up, and for the everyday habit of earthquake readiness to quietly disappear. Granada sits in one of the most seismically active regions of the Iberian Peninsula, and yet for most of the people living there right now, this is the first time the ground has genuinely frightened them. But Saturday's quake didn't end anything. It started something. Within hours, the counter at IGN began to climb, and it did not stop at 10 or 50 or 100. It climbed toward 348. Now zoom in on the city itself. Granada City holds roughly 230,000 residents, and the wider metropolitan area comes to about 500,000 people. Every single epicenter in this swarm sits within about 15 kilometers of that population. Some sit within 8. There is no buffer zone here, no empty stretch of desert between the fault and the neighborhoods. The Vega de Granada is a dense ring of towns pressed right up against the city, and the shaking has been happening directly underneath it. The most visible reaction came from the Alhambra. The Alhambra is the hilltop palace and fortress complex that UNESCO lists as a World Heritage Site, and it is the most visited monument in all of Spain, drawing millions of people every year. When the ground moved, staff evacuated the Alcazaba, the old military fortress section, and the Nasrid palaces, the delicate royal rooms famous for their carved plaster and tile work. That was a precaution, not a response to any collapse. But consider what a precaution at that scale means. Officials cleared thousands of visitors out of a structure built more than 7 centuries ago because they could not be certain in that moment what the next tremor would do. The Alhambra has survived centuries of Granada's tremors, including 1956, and it has survived because it was built heavy, low, and thick. Closing it is still not a small decision. Tourism is a huge share of this city's income, and an empty ticket gate in August is money that does not come back. Hotels near the monument emptied out as well. Guests stood on the pavement with luggage while staff walked the corridors floor by floor. Across residential Granada, the damage shows up in exactly the pattern engineers expect from this kind of shaking. Cracked facades, bricks dislodged from upper walls, pieces of cornice and plaster scattered on the pavement below. Nothing has come down whole. But falling debris is how moderate earthquakes hurt people in old cities, and Granada is a very old city. After the magnitude 4.7 quake on Tuesday, August 18th, authorities confirmed 3 people with minor injuries. 3 is a small number, and it deserves to be said plainly. In a metropolitan area of 500,000 people sitting on top of a shallow swarm, 3 minor injuries is a genuinely good outcome. It is also a figure that depends heavily on timing and luck. A brick that falls at 10:37 on a weekday morning lands on a street that has people walking on it. The towns carrying this swarm are small, and their names have become a nightly list on Spanish news broadcasts. Alhendín, roughly 9,000 people. Gojar, closer to 6,000. Churiana de la Vega, nearly 17,000. Santa Fe, around 15,000. Atarfe, approaching 20,000. Not one of them sits more than 15 kilometers from central Granada, and several are inside 10. Add them to the city, and you have 500,000 people sharing one shallow, active patch of ground. Schools, clinics, and apartment blocks raised in the 1960s and 1970s, before modern Spanish seismic building codes existed. That is the real exposure in Granada, and it has nothing to do with the monument on the hill. Then there is the part that appears in no damage report. Sleep. People in the Vega are living inside 4 days of constant alertness right now, waking at every truck that passes, checking the light fixtures, watching the water in a glass. The anxiety calls from Saturday were not an overreaction. They were the correct human response to an environment that keeps moving without warning. Teachers are running drills. Parents are keeping shoes beside the bed. Tourists are asking hotel desks questions that hotel desks cannot answer. The damage is visible. The bigger question is why this keeps happening. What is actually happening underground in Granada? The short answer is an earthquake swarm. A swarm is a cluster of many earthquakes striking one small area over a short period without one clearly dominant quake. That last part is what separates it from what most people picture. In a normal sequence, one large main shock hits. Then a series of aftershocks follows, each generally smaller than the one before as the rock settles into a new position. An aftershock is simply that, a smaller quake that follows a bigger one in the same place while the ground finishes adjusting. In a swarm, the pattern is messier. Energy releases in bursts from slightly different points, and the biggest event is not guaranteed to be the first one. That is the uncomfortable part, and there is no honest way around it. Because a swarm has no reliable ranking, scientists cannot look at Saturday's magnitude 4.8 and declare it the ceiling. They can only watch what the ground does next. It is why the language coming from officials has stayed so carefully worded. Depth is the second key. Virtually every one of the 348 recorded events has been shallower than 10 kilometers. And the magnitude 4.7 on Tuesday was measured at about 5 kilometers down. 5 kilometers is shorter than many city bus routes, except pointed straight down. At that distance, the energy arrives at the surface almost undiluted, which is why moderate magnitudes here are producing sharp, loud, frightening jolts rather than a slow roll. Tuesday morning is the clearest example of how a swarm behaves. At 10:37, the magnitude 4.7 struck near Gojar. 16 minutes later, a separate magnitude 4.0 hit under Churiana de la Vega, a few kilometers away. 2 towns, 2 epicenters, 1 hour. For anyone standing in a classroom or an office between them, there was no time to decide the first one was over before the second arrived. Of the 348 events, residents have actually felt 37, and Tuesday delivered several of those inside that single hour. IGN's response has been practical. The agency deployed 2 additional portable seismic stations into the affected area. That sounds like a small step, and in equipment terms it is, but the purpose is precision. More instruments closer to the source means better fixes on depth and location, and better depth data is exactly what tells scientists which fault is moving and how much of it is involved. Right now, that mapping work is happening while the swarm is still active, which is the hardest and most valuable time to do it. Geologist Mercedes Feriche, who works on seismic risk in Granada, has given the clearest public read on the trend. Her assessment is that the aftershocks are getting weaker and less frequent, which is a positive sign in the direction anyone would want to see. She has been equally direct about the limit of that. Another quake of similar strength cannot be ruled out, and nobody can predict when. That is not hedging. That is the actual state of earthquake science today. We can measure what has already happened with extraordinary accuracy and describe trends with real confidence. We cannot tell you what Thursday looks like. The University of Granada, which sits inside the shaking zone, has published public earthquake safety guidance for residents. Get low, cover your head, stay away from windows and balconies, learn which wall in your home is strongest, never use the elevator. Basic instructions published because a university in a seismic city understands that safety habits fade across 70 quiet years. This isn't the first time Granada's ground has done this. Granada has been here before, but not quite like this. Between December 2020 and August 2021, the same general area went through a swarm centered on Atarfe and Santa Fe. It produced more than 3,000 earthquakes across roughly 8 months. 3,000. That figure sounds far worse than 348, and in raw count it clearly is. The character was completely different. Out of those 3,000 plus events, only 6 ever reached magnitude 4 or above. And the strongest topped out around moment magnitude 4.4. That is a swarm that shook constantly and stayed small. It exhausted people all the same. Families in Atarfe slept in cars for weeks, schools closed for inspections, and nerves across the Vega frayed badly. Structurally, though, the ceiling held. A later study by University of Granada researchers found that the 2021 swarm was effectively confined, held in place by the surrounding fault structures so the movement could not extend far enough to generate a much larger quake. That is a reassuring finding after the fact. It is not a guarantee that transfers automatically to a new swarm on a different patch of ground. Compare the rhythms. The 2021 swarm needed 8 months to produce 6 quakes at magnitude 4 or higher. This swarm has produced at least 2 above magnitude 4.7 inside its first 4 days, plus the magnitude 4.0 on Tuesday. Same city, same broad fault system, 2 entirely different tempos. That does not mean this swarm ends worse. It has a far shorter track record, and short records are exactly what scientists refuse to extrapolate from. What it does mean is that the comparison people reach for instinctively, 2021, is not a reliable template for what Granada is living through now. For the outer boundary of what this region's faults have produced, the record includes the 1954 earthquake near Geological, measured at magnitude 7.8. That event was extraordinarily deep, hundreds of kilometers below the surface, and it belongs in this script for one reason only: to show the full range of the system. It is not a forecast, and it is not a comparison. Nothing in the current data points toward anything remotely like it, and misusing that number would be the exact dramatization we promise to avoid. The most recent data shows the swarm is still awake. The largest aftershock recorded overall reached magnitude 3.3, and a separate magnitude 3.0 aftershock hit Churiana de la Vega on Wednesday, August 19th. Magnitude 3 quakes rarely damage anything at all. They also rarely go unnoticed at 5 kilometers depth in a dense town, and every one of them resets the clock inside somebody's head. Right now, the trend points downward in both size and frequency, which is genuinely good news. A trend is not the same thing as an ending. The question isn't whether Granada's ground is done moving, it's what happens if it isn't. Hold the 2 swarms side by side one final time. In 2021, more than 3,000 earthquakes rolled through this valley across 8 months and never once passed magnitude 4.4. In 4 days, this swarm has recorded 348 events and already crossed magnitude 4.7 twice. The first one shook constantly and stayed contained. The second one is louder, faster, and its ceiling is still unknown. Same city, same faults, two completely different rhythms, and only one of them has a known ending. That is the honest shape of this story. The instruments in Granada can tell scientists the shaking is easing. They can pin depth to within a kilometer and magnitude to a single decimal. What no instrument can do is tell 500,000 people the swarm is over, because earthquake science issues no such certificate. Prediction leaves a gap. Preparedness is the only thing that fills it. Granada's grandparents understood that in 1956, and 70 quiet years let everyone else forget it. Now a question for you. If you live somewhere the ground moves regularly, what is the one thing you keep ready for the day it moves without warning? Water, shoes, documents, a plan for the kids, a meeting point outside. Put it in the comments, because someone watching this tonight in the Vega de Granada may genuinely need that idea. Subscribe to Earth Dispatch and we will follow this swarm to its actual end, whether it keeps fading or delivers another major quake. And send this to anyone with family in southern Spain, or anyone traveling there this week. Understanding what is moving under Granada is worth far more than a headline about it, because the story under Granada is older than any of us, and it does not care about our news cycles. The Vega de Granada sits in a basin that has been slowly pulling apart while the mountains around it push up, and that contradiction is written into every fault map of the region. To the south, the Sierra Nevada rises. To the north, the basin sinks. Between them, a network of normal faults takes up the strain in small increments, most of them too small to feel, a few of them large enough to rearrange a town. The 1884 Andalusian earthquake did exactly that, and the villages that lost their churches and their roofs that Christmas were rebuilt on the same ground, because that ground is where the water and the soil and the work were. That is the tension the region lives with, not the abstract question of whether a fault will move, but the concrete one of what you build on top of it. Modern Spanish seismic code accounts for this. It sets design accelerations for the Granada Basin higher than for most of the country, and buildings raised under those rules have behaved the way the engineering promised. The buildings that worry seismologists are the older ones, the unreinforced masonry farmhouses and village terraces that predate any code at all, the ones with heavy tile roofs sitting on walls held together by little more than gravity and lime mortar. Those are the structures that turn moderate shaking into casualties. They are also, in many cases, the homes people cannot afford to leave or retrofit. So the swarm becomes a public conversation about money as much as geology. Retrofitting a stone farmhouse costs more than most families in a rural comarca can raise. Regional grants exist, but the paperwork moves slowly, and the awareness moves slower. Every seismic crisis produces a brief window when people care enough to act, and then the ground quiets and the window closes. Engineers in Granada have watched this cycle repeat for decades. They know that the most useful legacy of a swarm like this one is not the data it produces, but the decisions it prompts in the 6 months after the shaking stops. The instruments, meanwhile, keep listening. The Andalusian Institute of Geophysics runs stations across the basin, feeding a continuous stream to Madrid, where the national network cross-references and locates each event. What they are watching for is subtle, not just how many earthquakes, but whether the depths are migrating, whether the magnitudes are creeping upward, whether the intervals between events are shortening in a way that suggests a fault is not releasing stress, but concentrating it. So far, the signal has pointed toward release, toward a system letting go of accumulated strain in hundreds of manageable pieces rather than one unmanageable one. That is the hopeful reading, and it is the reading the data currently supports. But it is a reading, not a promise. Swarms in this basin have preceded larger events before, and no one working on this problem will tell you the possibility is closed. What they will tell you is that the appropriate response to uncertainty is not fear. It is preparation that costs you almost nothing on the days the ground stays still, and everything on the day it does not. Water in the cupboard, shoes by the bed, a place to meet outside where everyone knows to go. That is the whole lesson, and Granada has been teaching it for a very long time.